Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Gaithersburg Book Festival workshops. I am the chair of the workshops for the festival committee, and I'd like to welcome you and let you know that we have a whole lot of stuff on our virtual world for Gaithersburg Book Festival this year, and we're really happy that we were able to do this. It will be happening all month long, and you can look on the Gaithersburg Book Festival website and on our YouTube channel. Right now, we are going to enjoy a workshop with Arthur Klepchukov, and he's going to tell us all about how to submit work to get it published in a variety of places. Art has lived near the Black Sea, Virginia beaches, San Francisco ocean side, and now he's hanging out in Seattle, so he's likes water, it turns out. He hosts meetups for writers with Shut Up and Write, and his work has been published in a variety of places, including Glimmer Train in a collection of the best American mystery stories of 2019, The Common Magazine, and Necessary Fiction, among others. He says he's not a writer, but he's a person who writes. So you can follow Arthur's writing journey on his Twitter feed, which is at Arsenal of Words, all one word. And he is a living proof of his own teachings in that 2 or 3 years ago, his first submission to us was saying that he had been rejected hundreds of times and had only been published once. And here a couple of years later, I just read you a short list, but there was more. So he knows what he's talking about. So I'm going to introduce you to Art and have a great workshop. Thank you all for being involved. Art?
Thank you, Corinne, and welcome everyone. So this is how to submit your writing for publication. And I want to start by sharing my screen here really quickly and saying congratulations, because you've all been rejected. So this is a very natural part of submitting your work to be published. And I wanted to, ease the tension, get your first rejection out of the way. If it's not your first rejection, then I hope it looks somewhat familiar. The language here doesn't really matter at this point. We'll come back to this. But I do want you to understand that, rejection is extremely, extremely common. It's perfectly okay. And now we can all grieve together. So now that we've been rejected, let's talk about kind of why we're here. And Corinne just gave you a quick overview of my stats. But since I started submitting my writing in 2015, I've made over 400 submissions. I have 17 acceptances, which amounts to about a 4% acceptance rate. So I'm going to tell you those numbers because people often get hung up on the numbers, but I'm also going to say that they don't really matter. What matters is your writing journey, wherever your words take you, whichever audiences you might reach. That is far more important, and your effort is far more important than comparing yourself to other people or even yourself in the past. So for the scope of this workshop, I really want to focus on shorter writing. So I primarily write short stories, although I've gotten a couple of small things published in nonfiction. But short stories, poetry, and essays are primarily what you would find in literary journals or other magazines that publish short writing. There really isn't a market for that kind of work beyond literary journals and magazines for various reasons that I'm not really going to get into. But even with the focus on shorter writing, I do want to say that this workshop can benefit and inform your submissions of longer writing. Most of all, this process of submitting your writing, getting it out there in the world will help you build confidence. It'll really thicken your skin with rejections, which again, you will get rejected and it'll happen very many times and it'll be okay. You will survive and you will persist. You will also go through the process of writing cover letters to editors of literary journals and magazines. And cover letters will help you eventually write query letters if you decide to query an agent or an acquisitions editor with a novel or a memoir or a book manuscript. And ultimately, if you do get published, these are small wins that you can add to your writing bio. Again, as Corinne mentioned my background at the beginning, all of the places that you do share your work, let other folks know that you do treat writing seriously, that you do, other people have taken a vote of confidence in your work and they want to share it with their audiences. So even if you don't necessarily focus on short writing as much as long writing, I do believe that the submissions journey, your submissions journey, can definitely help you with any kind of writing that you do in the future and make you a more resilient writer overall. I do want to highlight that we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to go through a couple of sections with material. Hopefully, most of this answers questions that as they come up. But if you do have any questions at the end, there'll be plenty of time for them. So no worries there. All right. So where I really want to start with a submissions process is not really what people typically do, but I want to talk about why people submit, and specifically why you submit. So if you're on your computer right now or on a device, if you have a piece of paper ready, take 20 seconds and jot down a goal for why you want to send your writing out into the world. And wherever you are, however you can, even if you do it mentally, just please take a few seconds to do this. Okay, and we're all writing our goals down, and they're wonderful goals. Whatever comes to you first is, it's all, anything is on the table. All right, great. So hopefully you've written down an idea that came to you about why you want to get your writing out there in the world. And I would venture that most of you would say something about getting published or getting your work out there, getting recognition. But I would posit that the reason we send our work out is to be read. Publication is just simply the easiest way to accomplish that goal, the most well-known way to accomplish that goal. Your goals can also be quite varied and quite broad. You can set goals in terms of getting a certain amount of payment for your writing, for your poems, your stories, or your essays. You can also try to build a publication history. And I really want you to think about that goal that initially came to you, because that's probably what's emotionally driving your desire to share your words with the world, but also to not limit yourself to just one goal. The great thing about this is that you can, I found the more goals that I set, the more varied goals that I set, the easier it is for me to keep going throughout this process. So for example, if you write multiple kinds of things, you can vary your goals by genre. At one point, I've wanted to get, both literary fiction published and science fiction published. Along the way, I even got a crime story published. You can set goals that vary by length. I've been published in things as short as one sentence on Twitter, all the way to 10,000 words in a literary journal that goes to bookstores around the country. There are lots and lots of markets for the fiction writers in terms of flash fiction. Flash fiction is anything that's 1,000 words or less. And there are some journals that are dedicated to simply this, short form sorts of writing. In poetry, there's obviously very many different kinds and styles of poetry, from haikus and villanelles and sonnets and whatnot. So when you think about setting a goal in terms of length or format, you can try to set different goals for that. So if one path isn't really working out for you or not working out yet, it's much easier to keep going if you have a different direction to focus on. You can also set a goal based on what medium you want to appear in. So there are lots and lots of wonderful print literary journals and magazines. There are numerous places that publish exclusively online, some that do both. There are even, I've found a few journals that actually publish purely in audio. And it's another way to give a different dimension to your work. So again, you can set it as a goal to appear in print, to appear online, to appear in audio, to appear in an anthology, which is a collection of various forms of writing. You can even have a goal to appear in a particular market. I mean, I can safely speak for most fiction writers that would say that they would love to appear in the New Yorker, right? And as an audacious as a goal that might be, that's still something that, if that motivates you, if you want that sort of recognition into, that prestige from appearing in a place that you admire, absolutely a worthy goal. You can even, as Grin hinted at in talking about my background, you can set a goal to achieve a certain number of rejections. This one is particularly, I'm particularly fond of, because if you set a goal to get a certain number of rejections, then each rejection is actually a step towards your goal rather than a setback. So it's a small reframing of where you are in your journey, but it does remind you that it is a journey. It's not just a single path or a single dot with an end. And the reason why I want you to think so broadly about your submission goals is that the more of them you have and the more specificity that you can give some of them, the easier they are to chase. It's a lot easier to give up if you set one big scary goal and fall short of it for months or years at a time. Whereas if you're reaching for several things along the way, again, it's something that inspires me to keep trying. So I encourage you to try that as well. So that is why we want to submit. And I really encourage you throughout your writing journey to come back to your initial answer to what you wrote down, because again, I believe that speaks to what resonates and what's true to you. So then we should talk about what you want to submit. And here is a really important thing to remember. So I'm going to mention the phrase market a lot. And when I say market, I mean a place that publishes writing. So again, it's most likely a literary journal. It could be a magazine that publishes, crime or science fiction or poetry. Each market, each place that publishes writing, they only give one shot for any particular piece that you send them. So it doesn't matter how many drafts you've done. It doesn't matter how many drafts of that piece that you will do. A particular place, a particular market will only consider that piece once. So knowing that, what to submit means you never, ever send a first draft. Always revise your writing, always get it read by others. If you're not part of a critique group or part of your local writing community, it's a great way to engage. It's a great reason to get involved. Because again, that piece that you believe in and that you spent so much time on only has one shot with a particular market. So because you only have one shot, there's also, unfortunately, a very strict definition of previously published writing. So most markets that are looking for work, whether it's fiction or poetry or essays, they have a very strict definition of what is previously published. So posting something on social media, posting something in your blog, posting in any sort of way online that is publicly accessible, unfortunately counts as having previously published a piece. So with as much enthusiasm as you might have had when you shared a poem on Facebook or something on your blog, unfortunately that would make that piece of writing, that piece ineligible for most submissions. And I say that to not discourage you from sending that work out there, but to just create more work. So in summary, for what to submit, you want to send out your very, very best work and then challenge yourself to write better. We all have more than one piece in us. We all have more than one story, more than one essay, more than one poem. And this is just a reminder to, again, spend as much time and effort on it as you're willing. Make it the best that it can be on your own and with input from your writing community, your critique group, and others. And then send it off because that particular piece will only have one shot at a particular market. Okay, so that's what to submit. And now I want to talk about where we submit. This is actually a really fun part because there are so many submission opportunities out there. There are blog posts and entire Facebook groups and just so many communities devoted to sharing, hey, who's open for submissions this month? I actually maintain a list of submission opportunities that I use, and I'm happy to share that on my website at the end, where in fact, you actually will have like a deluge of opportunities. So it's never really a matter of finding who's open. It's more a matter of evaluating which opportunities are right for you and right for your writing. And the way I approach, where to submit is I submit where I want to be published. And I encourage you to do the same, to submit where you want to be published. And how do you know where you want to be published? There's only one really good way to learn, and that's to read, which we should all be, big fans of. So most independent bookstores have done a lovely job of curating literary journals and magazines in the periodical sections. So if you haven't visited one in the recent past and when things are, when the world's in a slightly safer place, I encourage you to do that. Large library systems like the San Francisco Public Library For example, they have active subscriptions to very many literary journals, and these are things that you can't check out from the library, but if you go to the page desk and ask for a few copies, they will lend you as many as you need to read right then and there. There's a collection of writing in anthologies like the Pushcart collections, which collect the best independent press, the best stories published by independent presses every year. Places like the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, which some of you may be near, have both literary journals on sale and a large library of resources that you can lend and check out and get a feel for what you like. And there are many, many, many journals that are online or have an online component to them where you can also engage with their writing and see if it fits with what you want to, with your writing and your style. So this sounds like a lot of work, and it certainly can be. So when I'm evaluating a place and deciding whether I want to submit there, it's really important to keep in mind that you want to read for submission, not just for pleasure. And if we take a step back and we think about one of these literary journals or magazines, one of these markets, the way they typically work is they have so many things coming in that they have what's called a slush pile. So in the days of, in the pre-internet days, the slush pile used to be an actual pile of, unopened mail or manuscripts that have not been read yet. Someone would, open a story that you sent them or a poem, put it at the top of the pile, and then someone else would, pick it off, read a little bit, and decide whether it seems like it's worth pursuing or not, and move on to the next piece. It sounds very cold and mechanical, but it can actually inform how you submit your stories, how you submit your writing publication. If you know that the average literary journal or market that you submit to is going to have this volume of submissions where they have to go through pieces in a slush pile, you can also approach reading their work that way. And I found this incredibly valuable for when I have, 10 literary journals with opportunities that are open this month, and I want to see where I want to send my work. If I had the time, obviously I would read, most of them cover to cover and fall in love with a few and send my work there. But given that we're all limited for time, I tend to read for submission and not just for pleasure. So to me, that means if I'm submitting a short story, I'll open a literary journal, if it's in print, go to the fiction section, pick out the first story, start reading. Give it a paragraph, give it a few paragraphs, give it to the end of the first page. If you're online, give it until you have to scroll a little bit. If at that point the story doesn't resonate with me, it hasn't reminded me of anything that I've written, and I don't feel compelled to keep reading, I just move on to the next story, the next thing in the fiction section, right? Or the next essay, if I was submitting an essay, the next poem. And I found this check a really useful way of really saving time and finding the work that truly deeply resonates with me. Because when I do that, the stories that sweep me up, that make me want to submit, I don't stop at the first page. I don't stop at the first paragraph. I just keep reading, and before I know it, I'm done, and I'm thinking and thinking about the story and telling people about it, and I can't wait to send them a piece of my own writing. Your goal should be to find things like that resonate with you on that level, and just the sheer volume of opportunities that are out there. You might need to employ some techniques like that to basically read like you're reading submissions that are coming into your literary journal rather than reading for pleasure. And I say that to encourage you to submit only where you've had time to read and compare with your writing. On a personal note, I just think it's unfair to ask a market to read and publish and invest in you and your words if you can't bother to even spend a little bit of time to read what they've published before. The people that tend to run these literary journals and magazines, this is largely a labor of love. Very few of them make any sort of sustainable money. A lot of them are backed by universities or graduate school programs. So they're doing this because of their love for the community and the craft of short stories and poems and essays. This is not like the publishing industry in the forms of agents and books. There's not big money here. So how you engage and how you feel like you've done justice to the literary community is always up to you. But I firmly believe in not submitting unless you've at least had a chance to read some of the work that's been published there before. Sometimes you might wonder if a submission opportunity is shady, if something is worth your time. And I thought this would be a much bigger concern when I was starting out, of being duped or being cheated out of money. I haven't found it to be as big of a problem in my couple of years of submitting so far. Mostly I use a couple of techniques to suss out anything that I have questions about. If you can read sample work that they published before, that's always a good sign. For literary journals and markets that are brand new, that haven't published their first issue, that might be a little bit harder, but you can look at the background of the people involved, if they've published before, if they've worked in literary journals, if they're active in their writing community. Those are always good signs. If a journal is associated with the university, it's very unlikely that a university would be involved in something that's nefarious for the writing community. There's an organization called the CLMP, and I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for right now. But they're also kind of a group of folks that publish literary journals and markets that adopt a shared code of ethics. So they agree to operate with certain standards in order to belong to that. So seeing the CLMP logo is a sign of faith in my name. If you Google the name of the publication or the contest that you're looking at and the word scam, and you're able to find anything, I mean, that's always also a sign, like if anyone has had problems submitting there before. But largely all of this is secondary to you enjoying the work that they published before, and you finding writing that you want to read. That to me is the greatest sign that you should submit there. So given that you're going to read a lot, hopefully I've inspired you to read a lot and to find work that you love. It's also important to track all these opportunities that are coming across, on your radar. And one thing that I like to do that I started doing very early on is actually track my submissions in a calendar. So I want to show you an example of, this was a screenshot of my calendar back in February. I actually have a separate deadlines calendar where every place that has a deadline ending on a particular day, I would put an event on my calendar. So I'm able to link back to the publication and their submission guidelines. And this really helps me see what I have time for. So if I see a lot of deadlines coming up at the end of the month, I know I should either make some time for reading or to get those journals or pieces of writing ahead of time, or to choose among the ones that might seem best to me. You won't necessarily have time to submit to everything, and that's okay. But having the option, having a little bit of the work done ahead of you and putting it into a place where you'll see it and you can act on it has made a very big difference for me. Especially so when I, overlay this calendar with the rest of things going on with my life, whether personally or for work or for travel. And I can see where some deadlines just naturally fit into open blocks of time, and other things are so impacted that I won't have time to submit. And hopefully I'll come back to them in a future year. Another great way to see who's open for submission and to track what's going on is to follow literary journals on social media. So a lot of literary journals tend to be very active on Twitter, especially, even more so than Facebook. They will post announcements for when they're open for submissions. Again, if they're associated with the university or some sort of volunteer effort, they're not necessarily open year round. So some places will be open for as little as a month out of the year. Some places will be open for up to 9 months and just slower during the summer. They won't be accepting submissions. And following them on social media is a great way to know when they're open, when they have a new contest, when they have a new editor, when they're looking for submissions on a specific theme. Most places also have a newsletter where they're happy to inform you of what's going on, if they're open for submissions or perhaps doing a special call. And I actually end up tracking a lot of these in my in a spreadsheet that I have, where I also track my actual submissions. And I will put things that are coming up that I haven't submitted to yet on that spreadsheet as a submission that I'm interested in. And I'm happy to share that at the end of the class as well. You'll see snippets of it here shortly. So that is where to submit. So we've talked about why, what, and where to submit. And now let's talk about the nitty-gritty details of how to submit. So when you look into one of these opportunities, what you're usually going to find is what are called submission guidelines. And submission guidelines look something like this. So usually it's a couple of paragraphs of text. Again, the details aren't super relevant at this moment. But they will spell out kind of what they're looking for, when the deadlines are, perhaps a word count for fiction, if they want a cover letter or a specific type of formatting. These guidelines are very helpful to you to know, what they expect of your work. But they're also very easy to not follow and thus get rejected. And if you're going to get rejected, I want it to be because you've done all the necessary homework up front, and it's because your writing isn't really a fit for where you're submitting, not because you missed a word count or your margins are incorrect or some sort of trivial thing that should be easy to follow. So to help myself along, what I like to do is I like to take these guidelines. And if you know, in this version, the things in yellow are things that are relevant to me submitting fiction. And I like to take these guidelines and make them into something a little bit more actionable like this. So on the left is the original guidelines, and on the right is just a handy little bullet list that's actually arranged in an order that's easier for me to follow. So I know when things are due, and I know that these are things I can check off as I'm preparing a submission and getting it ready. When I'm looking back at this, whether I come back to it in my calendar or at another point in time, this list is a lot easier to wrangle than having to reread these paragraphs over and over again. This example is from a blog post that, again, I'm happy to share at the end. But basically, the guidelines as written originally are for the benefit of the journal to say, hey, here's what we want. It's up to you to follow these. They're not really necessarily written for the benefit of the submitter. And simply highlighting the pieces that are relevant to you, pulling them out into an order that makes sense, again, will make the difference between you being able to follow them and thus have your writing be evaluated on its own merits, not on whether it's can follow guidelines or not. So hopefully that makes sense. A small little technique, but again, it's saved me a lot of time. Another piece of terminology that you'll find in guidelines is right here. It says multiple submissions will not be read. There's terminology that appears all over talking about multiple submissions and simultaneous submissions. And the difference can be a little bit confusing. So I found this very handy diagram from a service called Duotrope, where they explain it this way. A simultaneous submission is you taking one story and sending it to multiple markets at the same time. So story A goes to X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Multiple submissions means you're sending stories A, B, C, D, and E all to the same market, all to the same literary journal or magazine. The difference matters very much so because, again, if you keep in mind that you want to send your very best writing, multiple submissions doesn't always make as much sense. It's unlikely in this case, if you had 5 poems that were all so amazing that you wanted to send them at once to the same place. Actually, sorry, poetry is not a great example in this case, only because poetry is usually submitted several poems at a time. Let's use essays as an example. It's unlikely that I, as a nonfiction writer, would have 5 very polished essays that are all relevant to one journal or one magazine. I think I would have better luck submitting these to the most relevant places rather than bombarding one place with 5 pieces that I think are all publication ready. So multiple submissions, even if they accept them, I tend to not really indulge. I tend to wait and make sure that my pieces are all really good before and send them out individually. Simultaneous submissions are a lot more interesting. So you as a writer want to give your piece, your poem, your short story, your essay, the best chance it has of finding a home and being read. So from your perspective, from the perspective of a submitter, you want your writing to be in as many places at once and be evaluated by as many people as it can be. From the perspective of a literary journal or a magazine, Um, it doesn't quite work that way. What happens is, what has happened in the past is a submitter has sent the same story to 5 different places. The last place, let's say, read the story, loved it, got back to them, accepted it. They signed a contract, sold it, everything is great. But then one of the other 4 places says, hey, we love this story. We would love to publish it. They get back to you, the submitter, and you have to tell them, oh, I'm so sorry. I already sold that story to somebody else. That tends to dampen the relationship, to say the least. So there are places that actually don't allow simultaneous submissions, and they look very unfavorably upon people that participate in that practice. The nice benefit of places that don't do simultaneous submissions is they tend to get back to you faster. So I've seen this a lot in the science fiction and fantasy markets, where places say, hey, like, please don't submit simultaneously, but we understand that it's not favorable to you as a writer, so we'll make sure to get back to you within a week or within, a month. And their response times tend to be much, much shorter because they know that they are the only place that has the privilege of reading your work. In literary fiction, you see a lot more simultaneous submissions. You also see a lot more variety in response time. So, I mean, I've had at least one story that took over a year before I got a rejection for it. Before I got a response, and it was inevitably a rejection. So this difference is something that you'll come across, and just hopefully this diagram helps to explain the difference, because when people use simultaneous submissions or multiple submissions, they'll just use the terminology without really explaining what that means. Okay, something that you might encounter in submitting prose, so short stories or essays, is standard manuscript format. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it's a fairly simple format to follow, where you list your contact information, the title of the piece, and use standard margins and double spacing all around. If you see it, please follow it. If you don't, I still recommend following it for the sake of consistency and having a professional looking piece. If a journal asks for something different in their submission guidelines, follow that rather than standard manuscript format. But it's something to be aware of, not something to obsess about. The other fun piece that you might get is a request for a cover letter. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead here. Let's go back. So some journals will request a cover letter with your submissions. And what you see here is actually a template that I use for writing my cover letters. What I want to emphasize is this is not the thing that will get your story accepted. This is largely a professional formality, and it's a chance for you to make a positive impression. It's also not likely the thing that will get you rejected. But if a journal or a magazine asks for a cover letter, keep it short, keep it brief, keep it professional. Don't describe your work. You just want to hit a few key points. You want to address the cover letter to the most appropriate editor. So if I'm submitting a short story, then I want to address the fiction editor. If I'm submitting poems, the poetry editor, and a nonfiction editor, if there is one for essays. If there isn't, just use the highest ranking editor, the editor-in-chief that you find. You'll find the names of these folks in a copy of a literary journal or magazine, usually at the front. And if not, they're usually online in a section called the masthead or the about page of their website. You want to hit a few very basic points, like how long is the piece that you're submitting? So this might be word count for prose and line count for poetry. The title of the piece, which journal or contest you're sending it to, and then again, because of that difference between simultaneous submissions and how various people, either look favorably upon them or not, I tend to say that, hey, this is a simultaneous submission, and in the case that it is accepted somewhere else, I will make sure to let you know and withdraw it. So I'm not wasting your time, and you're not wasting my time. One thing that I love that I don't see enough folks do is I will also cite down here a story that I read in their publication that I enjoyed. And this is definitely a way to show that, hey, you've engaged with this market. You're not just sending out a template, even though this is a template that helps me keep things structured. It's a way to show that you've actually read where you're submitting to, that you found something that resonates. I've had editors that have accepted me before, and then in their acceptance reply, use the fact that, I cited a previous story to say, hey, that was also one of my favorite stories that we've ever published. I'm really glad it resonated with you too. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, it's just nice to let folks know that their hard efforts are appreciated, because you know that this fiction editor has spent time working with whoever wrote those, stories or essays or poems. And to see that acknowledged back is just a very nice reciprocal feeling. And then finally, you would include a short, brief professional bio. I would focus completely on writing as much as possible, anything relevant to writing. If you have previous publications, you can mention them. I would not, list out every place that you've been published. Just pick out the ones that might be most relevant to this journal, or are, make the nicest impression. If you don't have any publications, that's perfectly okay. There are very many journals and magazines that love publishing people for the first time. In fact, I would put that in your cover letter if you're submitting to a place like that, and say, hey, if accepted, this would be my first published short story. If accepted, this would be my first piece of flash fiction, or this would be my first story to appear in print, my first essay to be in, this sort of market. And that can actually, take what many people perceive to be a negative and reframe it as a positive, because they want to help people along their writing journey as much as they want to publish something that will just resonate with their readers. So cover letters, they really don't have to be very involved. Again, if you err on the side of being short and direct and just sticking to the facts of who you are and what you're submitting, that'll go a very long way. And this template is something that's available on my website, which I'll share at the end. Okay, so that is the cover letter. And what's next? Next is the actual submissions process. So what you will usually come across is a service called Submittable. In most literary journals and many other kinds of places that publish writing have moved to Submittable in recent years as a way to just receive submissions and communicate back to submitters about the status of them. For submitters, it's free to create an account, and usually it costs a small amount, like $2 to $3 to submit to some places. There are many journals that accept submissions entirely for free. Submittable even has ways to search for journals that are only, no-fee submissions. And I would say the submission fee is definitely a controversial topic. You'll get a lot of opinions on both sides of the debate about people saying that journals need some sort of income to survive, because again, this is largely a volunteer effort, largely a labor of love. And you'll get other folks saying, hey, this is prohibitive to people participating that are might not have the same kinds of disposable income, or might not have just the ability to pay for something with a credit card online. I would encourage you, if you are in any sort of financial situation and you are interested in a place that discharges submission fee, it never hurts to reach out to the editor and say, hey, I'm really interested in sharing my writing with you. This fee makes it harder for me to share my work. Would you consider reading it anyway? Is there any way to work around this? I've seen many journals and many contests actually have different tiers of where people essentially chip in their fee to help someone else submit for free, or again, for people that are in different financial situations, to basically help them still be involved in this literary community. And again, the fee is small fees are unfortunately very common. I would not let them scare you away from submitting if it's a place that you've read and vetted and truly believe in and would love to see your writing there. It is by no means an indication of any sort of scam. And I have noticed that for literary fiction specifically, they do tend to charge fees much more often than science fiction or crime fiction. I can't really speak to poetry or essays in this regard because I have not submitted enough of either. And if you do choose to submit to writing contests or anthologies or larger things, the submission fees will be much higher. And again, I would just use your best judgment for whether you think that's worth it. So Submittable will primarily be the main tool that you use to get your writing out there. Occasionally you'll do another online form of some sort. Sometimes you'll send things out by email. And still from time to time, you do see paper submissions and mailed submissions. And those are especially fun because they do make you feel like you're coming from a different time. And when you do get a response, you actually get something in the mail, which is kind of nice. And when you hear all those stories about Stephen King collecting his rejections, those are all mailed rejections. So the fact that you have so many different ways to submit, and again, just use whichever method the place that you're submitting to wants to accept submissions. Usually they don't give you an option. They just say, here's Submittable, or here's our email address. You want to track all these submissions in some central place. So Submittable itself actually gives you some tools to track all the places that you've submitted to via Submittable, but it doesn't help you with things that are necessarily, just emailed or kind of outside of that ecosystem. They've recently added tools to that effect, but that's still, sorry, bouncing around. But what I've preferred to do for the last few years is actually track all of my submissions in a spreadsheet. So here's an example of a spreadsheet that I, with fake markets and fake titles. It really doesn't have to be very complicated at all. So some of the things that I've tracked before are, when a submission is due, who I'm sending it to, perhaps how much it costs, that important question about submitting simultaneously or not, what I'm sending them, perhaps what draft, and then the dates where I submitted and if they responded. You can track as much or as little information as is relevant to you, but I found that actually adding a little bit more detail. So for example, can I submit simultaneously? A no would mean that, hey, if this piece is out on a non-simultaneous submission, I'm not going to send it somewhere else. And this is an opportunity for me to remember that. If a place has a very high submission fee, and they end up doing, an open reading period, every month, I'll probably reconsider because I'll see that I submitted to them recently, and it was a little bit expensive. Another thing that you'll see is, you can do the math. A spreadsheet can do the math for you between how long it's been since you submitted, right? So today minus the submission date, and you can see how many days it's been out for until it's been a response. And we'll talk about that next. But in general, this just helps me keep my work organized, helps keep me professional. So again, if something is accepted, I know where to withdraw the piece from. And I know kind of everywhere that I've put in the effort to send my work. So it just goes a long way towards treating it as a professional exercise, not simply as something you fire off on a whim. All right. So after you hit the submit button or the send button, or you package up your wonderful piece of writing in an envelope and drop it in the mail, next is the waiting game. So what do you do after you've submitted a piece? So definitely keep reading new markets, keep reading places that are open for submission, that you're interested in, that you come across, that a friend might lend you, that you find in the library or a bookstore or somewhere online. And keep writing new drafts. I think it's crucial to remember that submissions are only a part of your journey in writing. Once I've gotten to the swing of doing this regularly, I actually found it really tempting to just keep sending work out to the detriment of writing new work or writing new drafts of existing work. It's really important to remember to stay active with all parts of your craft. This is only a part of your journey, but if you're not writing new work or revising existing work, this isn't, this is a little bit of a trap to get stuck in. So submissions shouldn't be the only thing that you're doing. Again, when I mentioned briefly before that people do tend to fixate on the numbers so much. So how long it takes a place to respond is a bit of a trap. Some places promise that they'll respond in a certain time frame, and if they don't, it might give you a false sense of hope that, hey, they said 3 months and it's been 4, which means, wow, they must really love my writing. and it must be, debated on furiously by the editors of this journal, where realistically speaking, you just don't know. They might be behind, they might be overwhelmed with submissions, someone might have taken sick leave. There are 100 different reasons why your piece is taking longer to read and get back to you than you expected. And that's okay, because it's out of your control. I highly, highly encourage you to not obsess about the numbers, how long it's taking. I tend to check my things once a month, and then if it's been a little bit too long, like say 3 months for the average literary journal, or if the submission guidelines say, hey, we tend to get back in this amount of time, then I'll try to follow up with the journal and say, hey, what's the status of this piece of writing that I sent you back in, on this date or this time. In fact, in terms of checking stats, I can tell you a fun little aside. So in my time actually working as a designer for Submittable, we worked on the colors of these little badges of this view of all the work that I've submitted. And people are so attached to, what does in progress mean? What does received mean? What does sent mean? That even changing the colors slightly elicited a really strong visceral reaction from all the submitters, because they didn't understand why things were changing, what it means. We ascribe a lot of meaning to these things because we take our writing very seriously. We want it to go very far. But frankly, again, this is something that's out of your control. So what's in progress to one journal might be what's just received to another journal. And because you don't know, and it would be unprofessional to ask, I encourage you to not invest so much into that. Just again, keep reading and trying to find markets that you like, that you admire, where you want your writing to appear, and keep writing new drafts. I firmly believe that that's the best use of your time while you're waiting for a response. So what comes next is when you do get a response, and that is most likely a rejection. And because we've been through this experience before, right, at the beginning of the class, it's okay. We've all gotten one rejection already today. So there's no need to stress out. There's no need to run away or fear this. It's an inevitable part of the process. What I like to do when I get a rejection is the very first thing is I go back to my spreadsheet, back to the submissions tracker. I update the date when I got the response, and I just say it was a rejection. And it's a very small action, but it reminds me that this is a pebble in a long journey. This is a step along the process. It's not necessarily the end. If you are submitting simultaneously, it reminds you that the piece is still out there somewhere else, and gives you a little bit of hope that, hey, this place didn't like it or didn't take it, but other folks are still considering it. This is not the end of even this draft of this story or this poem or this essay. And after a while, just doing kind of the logical part of the process, it really encourages me to submit the piece again, because I see that this is a common occurrence and not an individual, heartbreaking act. Even if you do react emotionally, and it's perfectly okay to do that, but just realize that it's a part of a longer journey. So what do rejections mean? People spend a lot of time fixating on the language here. So in the example that we saw in the beginning of the class, this rejection was largely impersonal. It doesn't use the submitter's name. It doesn't use the name of the piece that you submitted, and it's signed by the editors. Other rejections tend to be encouraging, and they'll address you specifically. They'll use the title of the story or a piece that you submitted, and they'll even say something nice like, we hope to see you around Tin House again. It's a privilege to read your work. The specific language does not really matter. What really matters is, are you going to send another piece of work to this place again? And the answer is completely up to you, but I will say that when editors say they're happy to see more of your work, they mean it. So I would take that seriously and consider sending them something again. And that doesn't mean right now, as soon as you got the rejection. It doesn't mean tomorrow. It doesn't mean the very next thing you're working on. It means when you feel like you have something ready and that reminds you of writing that they've published, send it along. And you can even use this this encouraging rejection to say, hey, thanks so much, dear, Alana Sapos. Thanks so much for reading my previous submission, Glimmering Sidewalks. I'm happy to submit another story, and then follow the cover letter template. So the key thing is to not read into the response, but just, are you going to send more work here again or not? One fun thing I do to make my rejections sting a lot less is I actually share them very, very publicly. So before I got my first acceptance, I actually spent most of the time posting every single rejection that I got to all of my friends and family, which made them think I was crazy, but it took out the sting because they saw that I was participating, that I was pursuing this goal, and that I wasn't let down by just being told no a few times. I've actually gotten this more fun habit of publishing all the rejections I get in a quarter in my blog in a post called The Rejection Quarterly. So I'm kind of poking fun at the whole submission process and saying, hey, I'm going to publish my rejections as well as my actual stories. But again, treat it as a part of the process. It's not the end. It simply means not this piece, not this draft of this piece in this place. That's all. So if you do get rejected and you keep going, I also want to encourage you to revise and resubmit. I would say pick a number, just pick a magic number of rejections. Mine is usually 10, and it's completely arbitrary. So if a piece that I've sent out has gotten 10 rejections, my number or your number, if any of them encourage you to submit again, keep going. That means at least one person, at least one market, at least one editor thought that there was something here that's interesting. Perhaps someone else will like it even more and accept it. If you've hit your number, if I've hit 10 rejections for a particular piece and none of them encourage me to submit again or inspire me to submit again, then I'll take a step back and say, hey, well, maybe I sent out a draft that was still a little bit too early. Maybe this needs a little bit more work. And again, I would go back to try to do another draft, try to put it through a critique group, try to reread it with a fresh perspective, because it's probably been some time since I wrote the last draft, and see what I can change. The one side effect of sending stuff out too early is not only is it likely to get rejected, but unfortunately, you very, very rarely get any sort of actionable feedback on why it got rejected. It's very uncommon, given the volume of submissions, for editors to provide personal feedback on a piece that was rejected. But if you do get accepted, it's actually very common to work closely with editors on line edits or in kind of sussing out and making the story or submission even stronger. So unfortunately, that's something they reserve for the writers that they do accept. So it's another reason to just do the absolute best with your work before you send it out. And then again, keep in mind that it will get rejected, and you can still revise and submit somewhere new at this point. So again, in this example with Alana and Tin House Online, I could not send them Glimmering Sidewalks again. I cannot emphasize that enough. If I did 5 more drafts of this story and it was the best story I've ever written, I cannot send it to Tin House Online again. Each editor will only read a given story from a given author once. And again, so please, please, please send your very best work and not just the thing that you're most excited about right now. All right, and then if you take a look at this whole process and you say, wow, this is far more work than I expected. I don't know if I want to put in all this time. I don't know if I'm willing to get rejected this much. Maybe it's not for me. Maybe I want to walk away. If you're considering giving up at any point, which again, a perfectly fair, perfectly logical reaction to getting told no very many times, I want to, again, give you a bit of numbers that are purely my numbers, purely my journey. It is not for comparison. It's only for encouragement. It took me 128 submissions before my first acceptance, before my first publication. 128 times that I sent stuff out with the hope that it would get picked up by somebody before somebody was like, okay, we'll take a chance, we'll publish this. One of my favorite stories is actually one of my most rejected stories. And it got 24 rejections before I sent it to a crime magazine. And I didn't even firmly believe that this was a crime story. I just thought it was the most relevant thing I had, and I enjoyed the writing in this magazine. So the 25th time I sent it out, it was not only accepted, and not only was I paid more for it than any other story that I've published until that point, but a year later, it was included in the Best American Mystery Stories 2019, which is a very lovely anthology, a running series that they publish every year, and is one of those things that actually appears in, bookstores on shelves all over the country. And my little story that was rejected 24 times went much, much farther than I could have expected. And I think of that moment because what if I got to 24 rejections and I said, well, I guess nobody likes this. I guess this isn't for me. I guess 5 drafts of the story is not enough. And I should just call it. All of that effort would have been for naught. So I say that not to encourage you to blindly keep submitting in places that you haven't read on the hope, the off chance that someone will pick it up, but that it is a very long journey. It is a surprising journey. I've had stories picked up after 1 submission. I have things that are sitting at over 30 submissions that are still looking for a home, and that's all okay. In fact, the reason why I mention rejection so much in my and rejection goals even is my very best and most productive year doing this was actually when I aimed for 100 rejections in that year. And I made far more than that many submissions, and I got far more acceptances than I expected. Because when you're trying that hard for people to say no, inevitably you expose yourself to more opportunities for people to say yes. So the last part is the fun part. So what happens when somebody says yes, when somebody wants to publish your writing? So the very first thing you do, celebrate, share that acceptance email with anybody near you, and just give them your phone, your laptop, however you receive the news, and just watch their reaction as they read the news that you will be published somewhere. It is a delight. What I tend to do is I immediately thank the editors for taking the time to read my work and for being interested. I accept their offer for publication, and I will withdraw any simultaneous submissions. This is the part that's extremely important to do, just for the kindness of anyone else that might be reading your story. You need to let them know that it is no longer open for consideration. So places like Submittable make it really easy to there's literally a withdraw button on any submission that is still open. For places where you've sent by email or by snail mail, again, it's up to you to follow up with them and let them know. This is, again, where tracking all of your submissions in a spreadsheet is crucial. So you know who to re-engage with, where your story might have been submitted. One thing that's important, you won't always get a publication contract. I tend to find that it depends on the size of the journal or market that you're dealing with. But if you do, and especially if you don't, it's really important to clarify the rights. There's a little bit of language that you'll see from time to time about rights. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not really, I can't give legal advice, but these are things that are really easy to ask about and don't assume. So even if you don't get a contract, I would just, at least by email or in some written format, just clarify, hey, these are the rights that I'm exchanging for you for this story for a given period of time or indefinitely. I've never seen a case of rights being given away wholeheartedly or copyrights being given away. The story is still usually yours, or the poem or set of poems or essay. It's very much the permission to publish it for a given period of time in these mediums, or to have it listed online perpetually on behalf of this journal. They're not onerous at all. So I tend to track my publications as well, right next to my submissions. I'll see everywhere where I've submitted it, when it got published. This provides a really nice place to link back to those places. So if I'm, giving a shout out to where I've been before, where you can read my writing, this is a great place to store those links, those rights. And then there's a hidden column here about payment. So if you're very lucky, you'll get some amount of payment. Often it's nothing. Often you get a contributor's copy on print or digitally, and congratulations. Sometimes you get a token amount, which is a few dollars. At best, there's rates of like a certain number of cents per word, or a flat amount. I don't think this is really about the money. but it is something that, is worth tracking and seeing, like, if there's a trade-off between how much you spent on submission fees or postage, and how much you've taken back in. Occasionally you'll be surprised, and I think that's the most I could say there. Once you get accepted, this is a great chance to share the news. I love to say, hey, my story just got accepted for this place. And then when the publication actually comes out in a couple of weeks or months, then I'll say, hey, that story that was accepted now is published. Here's a link. Please check it out. Please support this wonderful journal or magazine. All of that is a great fodder for your cover letter, for your bio, right? To say, hey, I'm fortunate enough to have my words appear in these fine places. And the most important thing is that even with acceptances, it's very unlikely to change your rejection rate. No matter who's accepted you and how many times and where you've been published, you will still get rejected and it will still be okay. That was definitely a bit of a surprise to me, that no matter how much I've submitted and how many places have been kind enough to share my words with their readers, my acceptance and rejection rate largely has not changed. So again, most of it is about persistence and effort on your behalf. It's not really something that you can calculate or time. You can simply do the very best work, write the very best thing that you can, and send it to the most relevant place. So I want to leave some time right now for Q&A, and I also want to say that on my website, on arsenalofwords.com, there's an entire page full of resources about submissions. So a lot of the material I mentioned here, finding places to submit, the template for cover letters, for the submissions tracker, and a bunch of other relevant links if you want to go deeper on this topic, are all online. I'm happy to share any of this, and please reach out to me via email if you have any additional questions. If something doesn't make sense, it makes sense now, but doesn't make sense later, I'm more than happy to engage. My email address is also on there on the About page. And so that's arsenalofwords.com. And what I want to do now is actually pause, and I want to open things up to Q&A. So if you're joining us on a mobile device, I believe if you just tap your screen, you can use the raise your hand feature to ask a question. And if you are on a computer or a larger screen, you can raise your hand at the bottom of the Zoom window. And I will call on you, and then I think you will get a chance to talk, courtesy of the city of Gaithersburg. So I see a question from Mary. Thank you for being the first to ask.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I have a quick question. Sometimes when you're submitting, they don't give really great, some journals do not give quite a bit of information about the submission guidelines. And so I don't know whether I should include my contact information on my manuscript or not. And they usually have very specific, they either want to read it blind or they don't. But when they don't tell you on the submission guidelines, what should you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I find this all the time, that the submission guidelines tend to vary drastically. And some places are just, hey, send us an email. And they don't specify very much details at all. This is when, in the sense of, for prose, I default to standard manuscript format. So I definitely would include the contact info anyway, just assume, because that's what appears in standard manuscript format. And even for poetry, I would do that as well. I would assume that if a market does not ask specifically for blind submissions, that you should include your contact information. So that would be your full name or your pen name if you use one, your address, your mailing address, your email address, and if you're comfortable, your phone number. And I say that because we're still dealing with folks that have all sorts of processes for reviewing your work. So even if a journal publishes something only online, it's not unheard of to actually print out submissions that they receive by email. And I would hate for your writing to be lost in the ether because one of your pages didn't have your name on it. So I think it's always a good practice to include your contact info.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone else have a question? I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'm not sure if that means we're good, or if folks are looking for the raise hand button. Okay, we've got a question from Diane. Hi, Diane.
Hi, it's not really a question. I just wanted to say that you included so much information. Oh, my hand is tired. I wrote so much stuff down, and
Thank you.
I'm really grateful for that. You answered questions I didn't even think to ask about. So I just wanted to say thank you, and that's why I don't have a question.
Oh, that's great. Well, if you do think of anything, again, please feel free to email me. Yeah, it's been a really fun process for me to like participate and just feel engaged with the literary community in this way, and to give so many more ideas that I have of my own a chance. I mean, it's I love novels and longer writing as well, but it's really wonderful to be able to take an idea that's just a piece of flash fiction or a poem or a short essay or short story, and let it breathe and watch it go out into the world. So I only hope that I've encouraged some of you to do the same. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give it, I guess, another minute, and then perhaps we should wrap up then. I think we have another question from Diane.
I'm sorry, I did mean to ask you, are you sitting on a ball?
Yes, I'm actually sitting on the ball. Sorry.
Because you keep bumping up, and I kept, there's this woman on my job who sits on a ball to work, and I kept saying to myself, I think he's on a ball. Thanks for letting me know.
It's good for my posture. So
Oh,
yeah.
Definitely good. Yes.
Very, very, very perceptive. Use that in your writing. I hope you pay attention to that.
You're kind of bobbing there, so it was hard not to come up with that idea. Okay.
Great. And do we have any other lingering questions before I let everyone go? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, then thank you so much for your time. I hope I encourage you to send your writing out into the world, and happy submitting. Take care.